Meca Williams-Johnson at Georgia Southern University, and I will be moderating this session. We are so excited to have Dr. Gale Sinatra to present today. She really needs no introduction. However, I will present a brief bio as a way to initiate our conversation on the topic. Dr. Gale Sinatra, and that's G-A-L-E, is the Associate Dean for Research and Professor of Psychology and Education at the Rozier School of Education at the University of Southern California. She is the past editor of the APA Division 15 journal, Educational Psychologist, and she is currently the president-elect of Division 15. She is a fellow of APA, AERA, and the Society for Text and Discourse. She heads the Motivated Change Research Lab, and the mission of which is understanding the cognitive, motivational, and emotional processes that lead to attitude change, conceptual change, and successful STEM learning. We welcome you, Dr. Sinatra, and it is an honor to participate in this webinar. And as I mentioned participation, I must include that all are welcome to send in your questions to the chat box. Our voices will be muted during the presentation. I will receive the questions as they come in and will pose them at the end of the presentation. Welcome, Dr. Sinatra.
Thank you very much, Meca, for that lovely introduction, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, Division 15 members and other participants who are joining us today for this webinar. I'm honored to be able to share with you some of my thoughts about the public understanding of science. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge that this webinar has been conducted before, in part collaboratively with my colleague, Dr. Barbara Hofer from Middlebury College in Vermont. She and I have worked together and are continuing to work together on public understanding of science, research, and writing. And I also want to acknowledge my colleagues in the Motivated Change Research Lab group, and I'll present some of their research here today, and they obviously have contributed to a lot of my current thinking on this topic. So I want to start out with why is it important for the public to understand science? What are the values of science? And we also have to remind ourselves, what are the limitations of scientific knowledge? Well, democratic societies depend on citizens to make informed decisions about scientific issues, and these are issues that impact their health and well-being, as well as the impact that that has on their communities and in our nation, the planet, and we know what these issues are. We see them in the news all the time. These issues include things like vaccinations, whether to vaccinate your children, climate change, which is obviously impacting us globally, fracking, whether that is danger to water supply, stem cell research. You have to make decisions about if you have Parkinson's, is there a stem cell therapy that might be helpful to you? Genetically modified organisms, people are very concerned. Are they safe? Are they safe to eat? These are questions that confront citizens every day. And they're challenging. It is very challenging to evaluate the scientific claims and evidence on these complex issues. In part, it's difficult just because it's hard to understand the very premises of science on which these scientific issues are based. And what we see, because of these deep challenges, we see a strong disconnect between scientists' opinion on these types of issues and the opinion of the general public. So for example, if you just take a few of these topics and you look, here's some examples from the Pew Research Center, who does these public opinion surveys all the time, we see a strong disconnect between the public's perception of these issues and scientific perceptions of these issues. So safe to eat GMOs? Well, the public is not so sure, at coming in at about 37%. Scientists are coming in around 88%. Why is that important? Well, that's important because of the next issue, climate change. We see a big disconnect as well on the public's view of whether climate change is due to human activity or not. And GMO safety is a problem because as climate change worsens, we may need to modify foods even more to be drought tolerant or to grow in different places than they've grown before. What about just population rise or other issues? You go down the list and there's this strong disconnect. So what might be the cause of the disconnect? Well, some of it might be in the way that science is communicated to the general public. Some of it may be due to reporting. We've all seen the balanced reporting on issues may confuse the public when an issue's been fairly well resolved. So if there's two people who are on a news program and one is saying that humans are contributing to climate change and the other is not, that definitely gives the impression that it's a 50-50 proposition, and scientists are definitely not on the 50% side with human causes. So what we're seeing is a disproportionate visibility has been given to science denialists even, not just science skeptics. And that is leading to this disconnect we see between public opinion and scientific opinions. One final thing is to go even more, and that is that there are individuals who exploit the uncertainty in science and lead to what's called manufactured doubt. One of the best examples of this historically is when people were trying to deny the link between smoking and lung cancer. But that kind of manufactured doubt has spread beyond that issue to many other scientific issues we see today, where an industry arises that is manufacturing doubt against an issue that's fairly settled in the scientific community. So here's a good illustration of how that plays out. In this graph, we see the global warming debate. And the debate among scientists is, as the top graph shows, fairly settled, with the vast majority of scientists in agreement about the causes of climate change. But if we look at the next two images in this figure, you'll see that the public perception doesn't mirror the scientific evidence, but it mirrors the media coverage. And I don't think that anyone would think that's coincidental. So then that brings us to the issue of, well, what is controversial? What is a controversy in science? The graph on the right shows that the vast majority of climate articles during that time period were supporting climate change and human role in climate change. But as we saw in the previous graph, these issues are portrayed as controversial. But in some senses, some of these issues are only controversial among citizens and politicians and lay people because they don't have access to this vast majority of peer-reviewed and vetted journal articles. Issues like climate change, the age of the earth, natural selection, these are not controversial issues for experts in the area. However, they're portrayed as controversial and they're perceived as controversial in general public discourse. So when you see a graph like this that shows the consensus, it's really overwhelmingly on one side. And recently a study was published that has examined articles rejecting global warming and has found that many of those are flawed. So again, overwhelmingly scientific evidence points in a certain direction, but public opinion doesn't necessarily align. One reason for this lack of alignment, besides journalism and the reporting of a balanced perspective when it doesn't exist, is that there is beginning to be, over time, and has been, somewhat of an erosion of trust in experts and their expertise. And in part, that might be a good thing as information has become more democratized. But with the democratization of information, there's so much available information online. And this online information is very difficult to assess for validity, for accuracy, and for bias. And I think we all experienced that during the election of 2016 as information comes over your Facebook feed, many individuals, including myself, have fallen for what's now called fake news stories because they do seem credible or because they were shared by a friend. How do individuals decide what knowledge to accept as valid? And what authorities or expertise do individuals tend to trust? And what happens here is the role of social identity can strongly influence this process. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But it has been shown that you're much more likely to believe a scientific article that is posted by one of your friends on Facebook than you are if it comes from an expert source. So what does this say about scientific literacy? Is scientific literacy in crisis? Many people say it is, and many people argue that we need improved science education. And I would certainly agree that we do need to improve science education, and I'm deeply committed to that in my research and my work. But I do also know from our research and that of Division 15 members that adding knowledge is just not enough. And that means that there are many topics that are really hard to understand and very complex, and we do need to think about those in terms of how we communicate them and how the information is shared. But it isn't just about the knowledge that we're communicating to students in K-12 and higher ed in the public. It's also more than just content. What we need to do to produce people who are more scientifically literate is we need to help them understand the nature of science. And science educators have been saying this for a very long time. And we need to help the public understand where does this information come from? And more importantly, how was it produced? How did people come to determine that humans are impacting the climate? And how does that knowledge get validated? These are epistemological issues that are very challenging unless we have direct access to this information. It's also important to understand the limitations of science, because often people feel that science is making certain claims that actually scientists aren't making. So just these basic issues about science are what the public really needs to understand, and this is what the AAAS would recommend we all focus on in helping the public understand science. These four sort of pillars about science. That is that the world is understandable through systematic study, and science can't provide complete answers to all questions, but scientific knowledge is durable. And the most important, the last one, is that scientific ideas are subject to change. And I think this is the one that gives people the most trouble. Individuals often confuse sort of the tentativeness of science for uncertainty. So when we say that only 97% of scientists agree about global warming and its root causes, sometimes people feel like, well, it's not certain yet, so there's still a high degree of uncertainty. But of course, for scientists, that's about as certain as a complex issue that's not 100% predictable can be. So what we've been talking about the last couple slides requires epistemic cognition. So what's the role of epistemic cognition in understanding what the public perceives to be controversial issues? Well, epistemic cognition, as most of our Division 15 members know, is the ability to think about what counts as evidence and question what evidence is worth counting. It's very important when you have to resolve competing knowledge claims. How do you evaluate the information critically to resolve that discrepancy? We know that it involves integrating against multiple sources of information. Often, those sources are in contradiction with each other. And all of this has to happen in order to incorporate new knowledge as new information becomes available about a scientific topic. What about change? That's the main issue that I study in my research. How do people come to change on controversial issues that they perceive to be controversial? Well, what we like to say is it kind of requires a hat trick of change. And if you're not a hockey fan, what that means is it requires 3 types of change that are in and of themselves extremely difficult, but to get all 3 of them is even more difficult. The 3 types of change that are very interwoven and interlinked and difficult to achieve for controversial issues are conceptual change, and that means just overcoming basic misconceptions that we have about a topic. So a basic misconception about climate change is that human activity is incapable of affecting the planet. That's a common misconception. It's incapable of affecting the climate, I should say. The second type of change, and I link these together because they are inextricably linked, is attitudinal and emotional change. This type of change is a shift in valence from usually negative on controversial issues to positive. A shift in attitudes and emotions, they're so linked, it's very difficult to extract them, and both are critically important in controversial issues. And finally, we feel that epistemic conceptual change, which is changing one's thinking about the nature of knowledge itself and the nature of science and how it's conducted, might be the most important of all. And sadly, it's probably the most difficult to achieve. But when these 3 happen, you do see significant shifts in people's acceptance of scientific issues. Interestingly enough, conceptual change is often enough for non-controversial topics. We see that a lot in our research, that they don't necessarily require attitudinal change or emotional change, and they don't often require shifting the way you think about the nature of knowledge itself. So this hat trick is important for controversial issues, but basic misconceptions in terms of overcoming those is actually not as challenging as the 3 linked together. All right, so a couple of examples from our research program in our lab. I'd like to talk about Ben Hetty's research on genetically modified organisms, specifically GMFs, genetically modified foods. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about genetically modified organisms, and these misconceptions are tightly associated with very negative emotions and attitudes about GMOs. They're deeply visceral and deeply negative. However, Ben had success in using a refutation text to overcome these misconceptions. So refutation texts refute a common misconception, and in doing so, they provide an explanation of the correct scientific evidence. In this particular text that we used together, we refuted a number of misconceptions about GMOs. And the result was a reduction in some of the negativity in the emotions around them. So the negativity is associated with the misconception. The reduction in misconceptions and the resulting negative emotions being less negative was associated in a shift in attitudinal valence. And so all 3 of those shifted in this study by undercutting the misconceptions, reducing the negative emotions, people's attitudes towards GMOs were shifted. Here's another example coming from my colleague Doug Lombardi's work on plausibility. This is more on the epistemic conceptual change side. This is about reappraising how one views the plausibility of a scientific argument. And this involves critical evaluation. You need to critically evaluate evidence in order to have higher quality plausibility judgments. Why is this important? Well, some people find it implausible, for example, that humans could impact the planet. How does one do that? How does one provide critical evaluation? Well, it involves the coordination of theory and evidence in a conscious and controlled manner. And that requires work. That requires what I would call high metacognitive engagement, as we discussed in our conceptual change model. So quickly running through the details of this particular study, this was done with middle schoolers, and they were earth science students. This was done in a diverse neighborhood, and there were 14 classes, 7 of which received the critical evaluation intervention, which I'll describe, and the others were taught with the regular classroom instruction, and this was taught by classroom teachers. The design included some pre-instruction administration of some assessment instruments, and then the 2 classroom instructions occurred, the regular curriculum, and it was about climate change, and it involved questioning the evidence and making predictions. The treatment involved a climate change model evidence link diagram or MEL diagram and an explanatory task in the instructional activity, and I'll explain that. And of course, some post-assessments. So let's go over this model evidence link or MEL diagram. This is work that is based on Clark Chin and his colleagues' quite long research program on epistemic evaluation of evidence. We drew on that to create this MEL diagram for evaluating climate change evidence. What students do in this activity is they compare 2 models, Model A and Model B. In this case, Model A was the scientific model that humans are impacting the planet, the climate, and Model B was a standard skeptic model that the cause of climate change is increased solar radiation. So remember, these are middle schoolers, and they were able to compare 4 pieces of evidence and evaluate whether those evidences support, strongly support, contradict, or have nothing to do with the models. And they do that by drawing these arrows that represent those different relationships. So for evidence 1, they decide, does it strongly support or support or contradict or have nothing to do with Model A? And they do the same thing for Model B. And you run through each of the pieces of evidence. So what happened in this study after students participated in this activity, and of course there was more discussion of that as well, students rated the plausibility of each model, Model A and Model B, and they decided which model they thought was correct, in other words, the best evidence. What we saw was our findings indicated that from pre to post, those students who engaged in the model evidence link diagram and critically evaluated the evidence against the 2 models shifted quite a bit from pre to post in their evaluation of the plausibility of the scientific model that humans were impacting the climate. And they also shifted in the degree to which they rated the scientific model as more correct than the skeptic model. Now, an interesting thing about this finding that's not represented here in the graphs is Doug went back 6 months later and tested students, and they still retained a significant growth in both their plausibility and correctness view of the scientific model, even at that delay. Was there evidence of actual conceptual change as well? Yes, there was. So in this graph, you see that the treatment group that participated in the evaluation of evidence through the MEL diagram were much more likely to say that humans were contributing to the causes of climate change, and they were much less likely to endorse skeptic models such as orbital changes are contributing to climate change, or dust, or increased solar radiation. Those dropped off while the scientific evidence of human contributions to the climate increased. And those were obviously significant changes from pre to post. All right, so I'd like to move on to talk about then what is the relationship between attitudes and conceptual knowledge, because I think this is a very interesting and underexplored area. So the way that we like to think about this, and this comes from an article, a chapter actually, written in the handbook at EdPsych, so it's available to you members, and that is the relationship between conceptual knowledge and attitudinal knowledge. And I wrote this with my colleague Vivian Sarania. So you can have, as we think about it, you can have two types of conceptual knowledge. It can be accurate, or it can be inaccurate in terms of alignment with scientific ideas. And so we would call that a misconception from a scientific standpoint. And then your attitudes could be either pro or con. And I would also overlay on this emotions could be positive or negative. So this creates this set of profiles. And I'm going to go through each of these one at a time. So the first profile is you can have accurate conceptual knowledge and positive attitudes. In other words, you can think that humans are the cause of climate change, and you can be pro, for example, climate change mitigation strategies or initiatives. Okay, so that would be accurate knowledge and positive or pro attitudes. But you can also have accurate knowledge and have negative attitudes. So in this case, you could think that humans are contributing to climate change, but you could be against climate change mitigation strategies or initiatives. And perhaps you just think they're too expensive, or they're probably going to be ineffectual. So it isn't that you misunderstand the science, but you have a negative attitude towards what we should do about it. The third profile, profile C, is very interesting. This is someone who has a misconception about the scientific knowledge about climate change and also has a positive attitude. So for example, you can think that all pollution contributes equally to climate change, when in fact it's really CO2 emissions that's the big offender. And if you think all pollution is in favor of causes climate change, then you could be in favor of climate change initiatives, and so you would be pro. And that sounds okay, except it isn't, because perhaps you'd be in favor of the wrong climate change strategies. So if it's just basic dust in the atmosphere, or if it's trash on the side of the road, some people think these kinds of things contribute to climate change. And that would be sending you down the wrong road in regards to the kinds of mitigation strategies that we need to make an impact, which have to focus on CO2 emissions. This last profile, which is profile D, is what we in our lab call low-hanging fruit. And what we mean by that is we feel like this is the most positive opportunity for change. So these are individuals that have a misconception and negative attitudes. So just as we saw with the GMO study, if you have negative attitudes, they're probably linked to misconceptions, or they often are. And in this case, if you think climate change is not caused by humans, you would be against mitigative strategies that involve human activity. But this is the kind of profile that if you undercut the misconception by teaching the correct conception about the role of CO2 in increased global warming, then that's possible for you to shift then individuals' attitudes, and again, I should bring back in emotions. Well, I would be very remiss if I talked only about emotions, attitudes, and cognition. There are many motivations that influence scientific reasoning. And again, my colleagues Dorte Kahnhauks and Barbara Hofer and I have a couple of articles on this very topic. What are the emotions that influence scientific reasoning? Well, there are way too many to discuss it at length within our time today, but we do talk about several different categories of them in this particular article. So as I mentioned before, social identity is a very important influencer on scientific reasoning. So an example would be, I'm a conservative, and so I know conservatives reject climate change, so I have to reject climate change. So that would be an example of social identity framing the way one reasons about a scientific issue. One thing I want to make very clear is that social identity framing influencing scientific reasoning occurs across the political spectrum. Very many progressives and liberals fight against scientific information, just as conservatives do, and examples of that could be the anti-vaccination movement. So it is not one political point of view that resists scientific information. It's across the spectrum of political perspectives that often the social identity of your community may trump the thoughtful reasoning about a scientific issue. The kind of reasoning we were talking about earlier, weighing evidence and against two alternative hypotheses. All right, what about vested interest? Well, vested interest means that you literally do have maybe a monetary interest in a particular outcome, and that might influence your reasoning. There have been studies that have shown that countries with a high GDP tend to have, it's not a perfect correlation, tend to have lower climate change acceptance rates. And this could be because there's an economic interest in maintaining fossil fuels. So individuals, of course, would have also potential vested interest if maintaining a particular industry is a part of their livelihood. And it's very understandable how that might influence their thinking about a scientific issue. There is decades of work on the role of cognitive biases influencing people's thinking about scientific issues. A common cognitive bias would be the availability heuristic. So we all know Snowmageddon, when it snows unexpectedly in Washington, D.C., we have Senator Inhofe comes into chambers carrying a snowball declaring that climate change is over. That's an example of the availability heuristic. The snow is there. It makes one think that we aren't experiencing warming. After Hurricane Sandy, we saw a big shift in climate change acceptance and much more conversation about the link between climate change and increased storm strength. And it'll be interesting, sadly, to examine opinions in Texas and Florida after these two recent tragic events, whether people will be influenced by those. Again, availability heuristic, they're available, they're in everyone's thoughts. Will they be shifting people's willingness to think differently about climate change? And will that shift stick? In other words, after Sandy, people did become more open to climate change, but over time, that does tend to roll back a little bit towards prior perspectives. So there are many, many cognitive biases, and you could certainly look at the work of Kahneman and Tversky and all of the psychologists who have looked at biases, and you could see their influence on scientific reasoning and acceptance. What about epistemic motives? Well, something called need for closure and another thing called discomfort with ambiguity could definitely influence how people evaluate complex models, for example, climate models. So, for instance, people who have a high need for closure, you want to know the answers and you want to know them now. And people who are uncomfortable with ambiguity, which is you'd like to have more certain answers and you'd like to have those more certain answers right away, are less comfortable with climate models because the models, of course, are models and they're not perfect predictors. I think we saw excellent evidence of how this works in the hurricane in Florida last week, where we saw the European models and the American models making different projections of trajectory. And I'm sure everybody wanted certainty on that trajectory, but as we saw, that certainty is, at this point in time, and perhaps forever, impossible to obtain. All right, so I want to close my part of the presentation and move toward discussion here soon. I want to close with talking about implications of all of this type of work. I talk a lot about the implications of this work for educators, and one of the things that I'm strongly an advocate of, as are many of our Division 15 members, and that is teaching scientific processes to develop epistemic competence. So a good example of this is the type of reasoning and thinking we saw in the Lombardi study, where you have to weigh issues and arguments against the evidence, against two models, and think about where that evidence comes from. What is the source of that evidence? And how will we know whether that evidence is valid or reliable? You see some of the standards, like next generation science standards, talking so much more about the scientific practices, and standards like that, I think, are definitely trying to move towards this direction. Obviously, we want to teach for deeper understanding. There is a tendency, and there has been for quite some time, to cover so many topics. This has really been prominent since the rise of the testing industry. We want to prepare for the test, so we have to cover all the topics that might be on the test. And yet what that does is it doesn't leave teachers time to engage their students in deeper thinking and understanding necessary to understand such complex issues as we've been discussing today. We want to promote epistemic cognition. We want students to think about knowledge and where it comes from and be able to evaluate sources and evidence. And that's so much more important today with all the different evidence they see online, so much of which is contradictory. There are instructional scaffolds. We gave the example of the MEL. That's just one. There are hundreds of instructional scaffolds that can help teachers to help students do those kinds of weighing of evidence and critical evaluation. What are the implications for policy? I'm in a policy program here at Russer School. I think we need to fund more educational research on thinking. So we have been funding excellent research on outcomes. We've been funding excellent research on interventions. And I think there's been sort of less funding of basic research on the nature of the thought process itself. And that was the sort of heyday of early cognition that allowed us to make some advances in understanding the nature of cognitive thought. And we're seeing that that's gone away. And rightly so, people want educational research to have an impact on outcomes, and so do I. And so that work's important, and so I understand that. But I would like to see more funding on the basic processes of thinking and what causes someone thinking to run afoul of scientific understanding. I think that that's an important area to explore in more basic research, because I think it will ultimately have great impacts on public understanding of science. I think we should support standards that emphasize how to think over what to think, and we see this in Common Core and the next generation science standards, that these standards are trying to emphasize more of the thinking process, and I think that's something that I would support. Another thing I would support is the development of more malleable psychological skills and dispositions. So these are the interpersonal, intrapersonal dispositions that National Academy sometimes calls non-cognitive skills, which I'm not a fan of that term, but these are affective, emotional, and motivational skills and dispositions that are somewhat malleable. An example would be openness to alternative ideas. That is something that can shift with instruction over time. The evidence for that comes from examining students over long periods of time, like a degree program, and how they shift in their openness to new ideas through sustained engagement in critical thinking and reasoning. I think we need to push back on the current trend of ignoring the factual basis of claims. And so this is something that is rampant now, that everybody makes claims, and those claims are just then adjudicated in the court of public opinion or online or in social media, but rarely do we look for the factual basis of such a claim as thoughtfully as we need to do. And I think policy can make an impact on that, that we have to only support educational policies or practices that we have evidence to support. I think that we have to demand more rigorous teacher preparation standards. We have been, I think, lax on that. And an example would be there's not much science required of an elementary pre-service teacher. And so it's very hard to understand why would we expect elementary science teachers to be prepared to teach about complex scientific thinking and reasoning to elementary school students when they haven't had that preparation. Recently, my colleagues and I developed a intervention called speedometry, which is using Hot Wheels cars and tracks to think and reason about concepts like force and motion in young elementary school students. And one of the most interesting things about that project is the teachers were very excited to have the opportunity to have a curriculum and materials that help them teach science, because they felt so underprepared to do so. And they were very excited about the opportunity to have that scaffolded opportunity to teach about some science concepts that they didn't really have the expertise to do prior to our intervention. So I'd like to close with what are the implications for us as a division and our Division 15 members? Well, I think you need to communicate your research to the general public. What we do as Division 15 members is we're very good about communicating our research to each other. And we have such excellent researchers in Division 15, so many of whom are doing work directly relevant to all the types of things I was bringing up today. And yet, I don't think we do a good enough job, myself included, in communicating that research to the general public. There's so much more that we could do to help people understand these basic ways of thinking and reasoning we talked about today. We have so much to say about that. I think we need to get more involved in supporting ed policies that support teaching of science. I think traditionally Division 15 members haven't been as involved in ed policy decision making as we should be and as we can be. And that certainly isn't universal. We can point to many of our leadership who have been directly involved in policy and policy making, but in terms of the majority of our membership, I don't think that's true. And I think most of our members should be involved in contributing to supporting policies that support the teaching of science. I would encourage everybody in Division 15 to become active in scientific organizations. Of course, APA, of course, I want you all to be active in APA as a scientific organization, but I also want you to be involved in other scientific organizations like AAAS, like I'm a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists. I've participated in climate change organizations. So I think involvement in other scientific organizations in addition to APA is something that I would like to see our members do. I think there a lot of people in scientific communities are very interested in psychological research on thinking and reasoning and very interested in being helped to communicate their research more broadly to the general public. I would like to see our members become or remain more actively involved in teacher education. Many of our members are intimately involved in teacher education and actively so, but I feel like Division 15 members could be even more involved in teacher education and preparation. A good example is that I've had the honor of serving on the Coalition for Psychology in Schools and Education, which is an APA committee. And that committee, under the leadership of our Division 15 member, Eric Erdman, developed the top 20 principles. And I would encourage everyone to get on the APA website and get those top 20 principles for their teaching, particularly in teacher education. These top 20 principles have been widely, they're how to apply psychological findings to educational practice, these top 20 principles. And what we have found is that they're being adopted in teacher education programs. And I think that's a just beautiful example of how Division 15 members can be impactful in teacher education. And then lastly, support and recruit students, graduate students, to become APA members and to be involved in our organizations, as of course they're the future of these efforts that we were talking about today. And I'd love to hear your questions.
So the first question that I'd like to pose is from one of our members, and it's the NGSS integrates a good deal of understanding the processes of science in PK through 12 instruction. How can we better equip teachers and higher ed to promote better professional learning and opportunities to understand the nature of science?
That's a great question. There are many states who are adopting NGSS, and so that's great. If you're in a non-NGSS state, you can work to help your community learn about NGSS and hopefully get your state to adopt NGSS. And if you're in an NGSS state, you can help by familiarizing administrators in education and teachers with the standards and helping them understand how to enact those standards. So an example would be our speedometry curriculum, which we developed for 4th grade, and that's freely available, and you can look at that as an example. When we developed that, we developed it as aligned to NGSS standards. And so I think sharing that curriculum freely, as we did on the speedometry website with teachers, we know that it's been downloaded tens of thousands of times. And so that gives teachers NGSS aligned curriculum to enact. So I think that's one way you can help teach about the nature of science.
Okay. And then we have another question that is somewhat related. And there were 2 questions on this. In terms of closure, are people with a strong need for closure just a lost cause?
Oh, no. Yeah. No, I definitely don't. I definitely don't think so. This has been something that I've put a lot of thought into and a lot of effort into, and there are some dispositional factors that people think are not malleable. But I think the evidence suggests that while not every single person with a strong need for closure is open to new ideas by definition, I do think the kind of instruction that I talked about, long term, in other words, the kind of instruction where you are weighing issues and evidence and thinking critically, that can have an impact on the long term. So my argument for that is based on the shifts that you see in dispositions of students pre and post a degree program. That's where you have a long-term intervention of critical thinking, and you do see shifts in their perspectives related to openness to new ideas. And so, no, I don't think that they're at all a lost cause, but they're not going to change over a short-term intervention.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the next question that I'd like to pose says, how do we help support the value of expertise in our searchable world of today?
Wow, that's such a great question. I think Dan Willingham's book about expertise is a great resource, and I would recommend that. There is some excellent work by our Division 15 colleagues on source evaluation and how to promote source evaluation in our students. We are, as a division, our members are becoming much more involved in thinking about how to debunk myths. There's a lot of energy behind debunking myths about psychology, for example, right now. There's people working directly on that. The notion of using refutations to debunk myths is another example. So I think there's a lot of energy around helping people understand what they're seeing on the internet, and it's obviously a very important and timely topic, and I think Division 15 researchers have so much to contribute to this area, and many, of course, are already actively doing so.
Okay, and we have another question that is very similar, but I think you can address this in a slightly different way. The idea that scientific ideas can change seems to be what many science deniers hang their hats on. How can we communicate to the public that science can change, but that it doesn't mean that science is wrong or that anyone else's new idea about the scientific phenomenon might be correct?
That is a fundamental issue, and it goes with the teaching of the nature of science itself. the biggest strength of science is in its ability to change. Now, you know, it doesn't change easily. There's a lot of evidence that scientists, you know, who are people and have the same motives and emotions as the rest of us, you know, they don't individually change easily. So we know that change is hard, even for scientists themselves. But it's the strength of science that it can change over time. And I think that's what we need to fundamentally help the public understand, is that you can't wait to act until you have 100% of the evidence, because you'll really never have 100% of the evidence. And so understanding that we need to act on the best evidence that we have at the time, you know, that's where we need to shift the public towards. And it is difficult. You know, there were, I think, I was really interested in watching how people were looking at the path of Irma and looking at the different climate models, and people wanted to know, is it going to hit my town? And of course they want to know that. And of course, meteorologists wanted to tell them that. But they can only do as fast as the models they have at the time. And while those models were imperfect, they were pretty good, and they did give people some pretty good advance warning. So scientists will get better over time, and that's a change. That's the change that is positive, and that's something we can hopefully help people understand.
Okay, so the question is, as an educator, how would you address a disconnect between scientific knowledge that the student learns in class and what is taught at home concerning the controversial issues?
You know, that's an excellent, excellent question, and this comes into the issue of identity. So I've been collaborating with colleagues on this very issue. So Sarah Brownell and Elizabeth Barnes from Arizona State University, and Pat Hawley from Texas Tech. And in the research with those colleagues, they have been looking at how to teach evolution to Christians. And they've been having amazing success. Pat's approach is to work with Christian teachers, and Liz and Sarah have been working with Christian students in higher education. And in their approach, they've been bringing in scientists who are Christian themselves to talk with students about how they deal with issues of faith and issues of science, and how they resolve those for themselves. And I think this is an excellent approach, because back to this issue of identity, it gives the students in their classes someone to look to and identify with and say, there's a person who's a scientist and a Christian, and I don't have to necessarily, you know, change who I am in order to pursue science. So I think there's excellent work out there that is trying to meet students where they are and to appreciate the identity challenges that they have in both teaching and learning about controversial scientific issues that their own community may not agree with.
So we would like to thank you for your time and effort and preparation for this outstanding presentation. This connects everything that we do in educational psychology, from emotions and motivation to the cognitive effort and abilities that we employ. And I just appreciate it, as well as many of our members for Division 15.
All right. And I want to thank you, Meca, and Division 15 Webinar Committee and our members for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.